Distraction tactics. Distraction tactics. Distraction tactics. Discussing true grit. We all went alone. We thought it was good, but Joe was alert when he thought he would. Hello, everybody. Would you like to
Hello.
introduce yourselves before we get stuck into talking about the book?
Okay, I'm Charlotte Philby. I am an author of sort of non-traditional spy fiction, and I'm a journalist, and I adored the book, and I'm supposed to be talking about it.
And I'm Joe Haddo. I'm a podcast host and a radio producer, and I've got some thoughts on the book which might go down like a lead balloon.
Excellent. A cat amongst pigeons. That sounds fantastic.
Hello, I'm Charlie Barnes. Some of you watching this might recognise me from the back of the stage at Bastille concerts. And I have also read this book. It was given to me as a gift on a birthday or a Christmas, I think, by my sister, who is very clever and has wonderful taste in literature.
So we are here. This is the Distraction Tactics Book Club. We're here to talk about True Grit, basically to bounce off the thoughts of people who from around the world who are members of the book club who read Portis's novel and have opinions, positive and negative, and also for us to all just, I guess, engage with it. It's the story of a 14-year-old girl who is avenging the drunken murder of her father, and it's many things. I guess it's a revenge sort of western. It's from the perspective of a child, a male author, obviously writing as a 14-year-old girl. I'm summing it up terribly. I will probably go back and do this again, but
Well, let me start by saying I don't hate this book by any means, but this is a book which I have heard so much about from so many different people. And when you've got quotes from Roald Dahl on the back and an introduction from Donna Tartt, and when you have been asked by Dan and Charlie to read the book, and when you've had friends who say, "Oh, True Grit, I loved it," and then you hear from Charlotte Philby that she loved it too, you think, well, I must absolutely love this book then, because of all those amazing people that say it's great. And I didn't love it. I don't know if it's because I'm reading it in this strange time. I don't know if I wasn't in the right frame of mind. I really liked some bits of it, but I think I was expecting too much. Perhaps I was expecting too much. It had been so revered. It still is. And I just didn't quite get that love for it.
to have this sort of introduction by Donna Tartt, who is clearly such a, she so evangelizes about this novel, and it's such a hugely important book to her and her family, and part of their kind of lineage and stuff. I think it's interesting coming to a book with that level of expectation, and like Joe, completely fair point in terms of towering figures like Donna Tartt and Roald Dahl, and so many other people telling you that this is such an amazing, important novel. I think it's kind of a thing with so many books when you come to them and they have so much sort of weight and stock behind them. I think I was surprised by how funny she was. It's a recollection from a long, long time away in terms of much later in her life. The comic underpinning of so many of the situations, just funny little witty lines that made it even more human and more endearing, I thought, personally.
On the point of expectations, which is like I hadn't even considered that, like when I'd suggested it, getting that as a gift from my very clever, highly discerning taste big sister as a gift was that surprised me quite a bit, because I think probably because of it being a movie, but I'd like to think not in a snobbish way, but definitely in a snobbish way, I just never would have picked it up to read. I would have thought, oh no, there's something like great that I should be reading instead. It was just interesting to hear everyone talking about going in with like high expectations of this, like what is an example of what people refer to as the great American novel, because I went in absolutely not expecting anything really, and I didn't realize it had any of that lineage, and kind of forgot. Because it was like a couple of years ago that I read it, and I'd sort of forgotten all about that lineage between then and rereading it again now, and it's sort of reminded me like, oh no, yeah, this is like just potentially quite an important and certainly a very celebrated book.
I think I came to it knowing that it was an important and celebrated book, but feeling like, as a sort of, I was say young woman, that might be pushing it, as a youngish woman, that it wouldn't be relevant to me. So it's something that I could go in expecting, okay, this is going to be, you know, sort of macho, it's going to be loads of guns, it's going to be, you know, entertaining, but I'm not going to be profoundly moved by it. And I think that was the shocker, to come away feeling like I am in tears. Like it was so, it just cut so deep because how unexpected it was. It was like 1 minute you're like, you know, galloping through the desert and everyone's bleeding and it's all sort of very masculine, and the next minute someone's saying something that sort of really gets you at the back of the knees.
Do you think it's perhaps a kind of, I guess it's like you said, there's quotes from Roald Dahl, and it seems to be a kind of an author's and a writer's book. I, to be completely honest, was potentially more aware of it from its film adaptations than from the book itself. And I was thinking about it in the context of, you know, a year after the book was written, there was a film adaptation at which the author was, you know, was present on the set and kind of and involved to a certain extent. It came from a serialization and was made into, you know, was turned into a novel. I wonder if, because of that sort of interweaving of things, perhaps because Portis as an author didn't sort of shied away from celebrity and didn't really, you know, if there are things that sort of have led it to have a kind of cult classic status, but haven't really, I don't know, really driven it into the households of absolutely everybody, or I could be just completely wrong, and actually it's a much loved and respected classic that everybody's read. But I'm much like you, I'd not read it before, and I was quite excited with this book club to take on a recommendation, Charlie, and read something new, like, so we could all be reading this together for the first time.
Well, I saw the film in quite surreal circumstances. They have these like mother and baby screenings that you can go to when you have a newborn. You sort of go alone, your baby cries for it. But on this occasion, she actually slept, and it was the Coen brothers version of True Grit.
Oh, yeah.
It was one of those things where you don't really have a choice of what you're going to see, because it's just whatever happens to be on. And I loved it, and you know, it was just, everything about it was just phenomenal. There's just something so compelling about Mattie. I think it's impossible not to love her, and sort of partly because she's written from the, you know, she is a 14-year-old girl written from the perspective of a middle-aged man. Sort of moments where you see her fragility or her sort of leaning on the older men around her that she's employed to help her to get Tom Chaney, who killed her father. I just found it, I don't know if this time I read it in a very different, I sort of approached it, reading it for the first time in another deeply surreal environment. And I love the fact that it transported me away, and I expected it to be, you know, it's a very masculine film, and there was something much more nuanced I felt about the book. And even though it's sort of, in a way it's a really masculine book, there was something so sort of, I thought, tender about it, and there were several points at which I cried. I mean, it doesn't take much at the moment. Definitely the emotions are close to the surface, but by the final paragraph, I was absolutely in tears. I just thought he sort of captured the fragility of life and the way that people lean on one another, sort of friendships, loyalty, love, death, with just this amazing sort of emotion, but set within something that was so sort of lively and entertaining, and could have been just quite, you know, sort of a ballsy, you know, Western.
Bouncing off what you just said, Julia from the UK said, what do you think about a man writing a book from a girl's perspective? And Laura Gray from Wales said, do you think that Portis creates a convincing voice of a 14-year-old girl? and also, sorry, Joe Watts in Colorado said, I wonder what the decision to make the narrator and perspective a young girl meant for the outcome of the story. Do you think Portis kind of effectively...
I think it was hugely effective, and I think it was sort of particularly effective because he didn't seem to sort of reach for what one might imagine when sort of drawing a portrait of a girl. You know, there was nothing... She was as strong and kick-ass as any of the men who were around her, if not more so. And it's interesting, there's like a sort of a quite fleeting mention at one point. One of the characters is having a sort of malaria, it's in the throes of a malaria chill, and says something of actually, I've put a few post-it notes in my book. He says something about drowned like the fair Ophelia. Of course, with her, it was doubly tragic. She was distracted from a broken heart and did not do nothing to save herself. I'm amazed that people can bear up and carry on under these repeated blows. There is no end to them. And I feel like because Mattie is so young and sort of in a way quite untainted by the experiences that these men have had, that's what kind of, it's those contrasts that make her seem young and sort of inexperienced, rather than it being a show through the way that she's portrayed. Do you know what I mean? It sort of seems to be, he's just so clever with counterpoints, different people's personalities to sort of draw things out in a really laboured way.
I kind of like that. To me, she sort of comes to embody what true grit really is. And you know, even though she's looking for it in Rooster, it's kind of constantly evident in herself, in her like utter determination. There was a quote that I loved. I mean, there's so many good quotes, but you know, when she says, "If you want anything done right, you have to see to it yourself every time." I think I went through a sort of curve of really enjoying the book at the beginning, finding that the amount of time that was maybe spent in Fort Smith, I felt like it kind of dragged quite a lot. But then as they got going and the adventure sort of picked up, I kind of, I got right back into it and really enjoyed it through to the end. I mean, it's kind of bonkers in terms of the amount of time it spends in certain places and with certain people and the sort of tangents it goes off into, and yeah, like moments of kind of, like moments that made me laugh out loud, moments of really intense, quite shocking violence, like fingers getting chopped off and flying all over the place. Charlie, I know you are a huge fan of snakes, so I imagine really enjoyed the snake bit ending.
I am somewhat terrified of snakes, and the first time I read this, I did send my sister a message around that point where the book kind of went flying out of my hand because I was so terrified by the prospect of being faced with a skeleton whose ribcage is full of rattlesnakes. That is my idea of hell. I'm sure it's many of people's ideas of hell. But you know, I was reading a book for a lovely bit of escapism, and it took me right into the throes of my deepest fears, which wasn't particularly appreciated. Although it's a great action-packed sequence. All of that. There's a lot of setup and preamble for a 200-page novel. Like it's kind of seen as a bit of a juicy page turner for all ages, even though like a lot of the juice that's turning the pages is actually you know, for a 14-year-old or rather, so something that I think is quite important to remember when we're reading it is actually the recollections of an older lady of a time when she was 14. So unreliable narrator, which is quite an important part to remember, I think. But a lot of what keeps it juicy and turning is being part of the reminiscing about these stories of a 14-year-old having like quite intense dealings with livestock owners, all of those interactions. Like that was part of my favorite bit of the book, but maybe that's just because I'm quite a boring person. But I found that quite exciting and quite enviable. Just like just that, you know, this 14-year-old who can hold her own when discussing frank issues with people superior to her, or superior in age at least, and people of business. Like, oh Christ, I haven't got those kinds of guts or that sand to take the sort of Arkansas phrasing.
Charlotte, I thought it was interesting what you said about reading it. Obviously, the context in which we read something has, you know, a big impact on our relationship to it. And obviously this has been a really strange time for absolutely everybody. So like it kind of affected, but part of doing this distraction tactics thing, both the book club and the film club that we've been doing, is to use these stories, you know, be they cinematic or literary, as a way to travel, as a way to escape. Did you feel like suitably transported to?
I felt thoroughly transported, yeah. And actually, I've got quite a family in Arizona, so I travelled there quite a lot in my life, and obviously they're completely different. There's something about that sort of desert scape, and you know, the sort of the snakes, and just being at the sort of the end, feeling like you're at the end of the world, that I felt was really sort of conjured, and I felt like I was there. This is so rare. Like maybe this is just sort of particularly pertinent now. So many crime books that you read sort of start at this point with something happening, and then it's sort of left on a cliffhanger, and then they sort of meander back and forth to sort of ascertain what happened and why, where. But this is just so simple. It's like it's a revenge story. It starts here, and you get to there, and as you say, there's all these sort of like, you know, they'll go off on a tangent talking about Shakespeare or something else that, you know, comes up something that's quite profound. But essentially, it's just that. And in terms of the ease in keeping up with it, it's really effective for now, I think, maybe.
Can I make a point on that, which is that the thing that stood out for me, or one of the things that really stood out, is the language. It's Mattie's sort of sing-song style, and I do think that, you know, for a 215-page book, as Charlie said, it does sort of meander along, and it's very hard, I think, to get such an authentic voice, and to get a voice that really stands out like she does. And most of the characters do, actually, but her in particular. And I think that's one thing that, for me, Portis has done amazingly. And the other thing is that it's very, very, very hard to write a comic novel and to do it properly. And Dan, you were saying, you know, there were points where you did actually laugh out loud, and that is also true. I think he gets the comedy elements exactly right, and it's not too much comedy, and it's not too much Western, and it's not too much crime. It's almost like the balance is exactly right, and that for me is what carried me through it. And I know at the beginning I said, oh, you know, I didn't love it, and I don't think I do love it, but I would absolutely give this book to people, because I know lots of people who would love it, and especially at this time when people are looking for escapism and they want to just be transported, as you said. It's so well done, and it takes you to quite literally another world that I would, you know, heartily recommend it to people to read. It
feels very alive as a book in a way like that, which is probably quite a wanky term to use, but like a lot of the time when I read a book, I read the book and think, cool, I've read the book now. That has happened. I'm glad that I did it. But I very much can picture the person sat there writing the book and thinking, I'm going to write a book about this. Exemplified by the fact that it is first person narration of like an internal monologue for the most part. That kind of sing-song, beautiful, like influenced by all kinds of different the elements, like that just kind of southern vernacular really brings the book to life, and you feel like you can hear it, which I really like. Like you can just because of the turns of phrase, which might not even necessarily be turns of phrase that we as, like, you know, people in England will be at all familiar with, but you sort of feel like you know those phrases anyway, and it's so that kind of makes you feel alive. And I love the fact that the very last paragraph. So, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of heartache in the closing moments of the book, but the actual very last bit of the book is, for me, it kind of just made me giggle a little bit, because it was just one last kind of go to make you feel like this was a thing that really happened and this is a real person, because this ends my true account of how I avenged Frank Ross's blood over in the Choctaw Nation when snow was on the ground. It's just that using the last sentence to say, yeah, this is real, just made it feel very, very alive to me, which I liked.
What were the moments that kind of really got you?
I'm a big horse lover. So when Blackie died, that was tough.
Oh.
That was really tough. As he was rubbing the salt in the wound, it just got me there. So that sort of Black Beauty all over again. But I think it was the last section. Can I read it? It's just
please.
And I think when I was reading the piece that Charlie flagged in the New Yorker that Donna Tartt wrote about what the book meant to her, one of the things that she mentioned was that if you love the book, when you're reading it, or if you met someone who's read it, you'll sort of end up reading out quotes to them. So I was doing that, thinking in my head when I was reading it, I had this perfect like Southern drawl, and then my husband would walk into the room and I'd be like, let me just read you this book, and then I'd be
you have to do your Southern.
I'm going to do it in that angle. But what Donna Tartt also said is that in order to make it, in order to convey the brilliance, you have to really go back through the passage, because everything is so contextualized by everything else that's just happened. I heard nothing more of the Texas officer, Lviv. If he's yet alive and should happen to read these pages, I will be pleased to hear from him. I judge he is now in his 70s and nearer 80 than 70. I expect some of the starch has gone out with that cowlick. Time just gets away from us. And it was the time that gets away from us. I think I had a really nostalgic day anyway, and I was feeling like we're in lockdown. Do you remember those, suddenly all these memories flooding around and looking through childhood photos, and I was already feeling a bit vulnerable, and that line was just like,
yeah, it's beautiful, and it really sums up, I don't know about you guys, but it's the experience of time in lockdown has been such a strange one, where it is both so slow and also like a blink and half the year's gone by.
You have like the lengthy beautiful contextualized piece of writing, and then somewhere in the middle there will be a fucking corker of a fridge magnet in there. Like there is no knowing what's in a man's heart, and I would not put a thief in my mouth to steal my brains and stuff like that. Like there's just loads of killer one-liners.
See, we've all like read both the introduction by Donna Tartt, but also the piece that she wrote recently following Portis's death earlier this year. And it's just, there's something about reading the words of someone who is incredibly articulate and I respect a lot, but also who's just such a huge fan. There's something really infectious about it. And I think having spent the last couple of days having read the book, reading around it, so much happens in it as well in kind of quite a short space of time. Charlotte, like you said, it's interesting that the plot is pretty basic. It's a sort of, this happens, she wants to take revenge, she goes ahead and does it. But within that, she loses a limb. She's this kind of quite complex woman character. It's interesting they make a lot of her being, as an older person, being like a spinster, and definitely doesn't lose her sort of outspoken humor at all. There's so many good quotes. I mean, it's like you said, it's quite hard. We could probably spend quite a long time quoting at each other. Ella from Sweden wanted to know who your favorite character was. Was there a particular character that jumped out, or you felt was strong, or a bit or weaker, seeing as you hate the book so much?
You got to have one villain in this book club. No, I mean, I don't hate the book. I mean, it's obvious to say Matty, and I will say Matty, but I will also say Rooster, because it's weird. I don't think he comes in till about halfway through the book, and yet when I think back on it now, he is the book to me. It's her and him, and there's a whole big sort of setup, like you said, the whole going to the town, and then one of the scenes that stood out for me was her arguing with the horse trader and like being really stubborn about it. And like Charlie, I don't have a phobia of snakes, but I have got a phobia of rats. I hate rats, and there's a scene with a rat in there, which I just, it's only a couple of paragraphs, if that, and I was sort of doing that just to get rid of it. But for me, to answer the question from Sweden, I think Rooster, probably.
That rat bit was one of my favourite bits.
I hated it.
There was the question earlier about were there any parts that made you laugh out loud, and definitely the rat bit made me laugh out loud, because he's had a few whiskies, and he's got this rat cornered in the room, and he's going to take him out, but then he says that he's going to serve you a rat writ, and there's a bit of fun playing words, and then the last thing he says in response to his landlord is I was serving some papers, which I just like. That really made me laugh. The idea that, you know, this kind of big drunken like cowboy essentially has just tried to shoot a rat in the middle of the night, annoyed the hell out of his landlord, and tries to pass it off as him doing work, but you know that he's kind of smirking through saying that, and it's just that really tickled me. So sorry to really dig down into the rat section.
Yeah, we've said that there's been a lot of rat talk, and you know, I feel like maybe we have to move on.
I also thought like there were points where it was such a page turner as well. I thought it quite effectively, having set itself up in quite a slow, sort of meandering way. Like you said, Charlie, there was so much setup. There were then those moments like the standoff in the cabin, obviously the set. I don't know, just those sort of set pieces. The bit where she's sort of, you know, meandering down to that body of water, to the creek or river, or whatever it is, and she stumbles upon Cheney. Like, it was so exciting. I was like, this is amazing. You know, there were some real like gripping moments too, kind of in and amongst it all.
I think the book is very easy to read, isn't it? And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think you, and it's already been spoken about, you could offer this to almost anyone to read, of any level, of any interest, and they would get something out of it, because it's only 215 pages. And like you say, it is a page turner at places, but also I just think it flows so well that you would just read 50 pages and not realise that the time has gone by.
Before we all say goodbye, does anyone have any kind of parting thoughts, or anything you still want to get off your chest? Because
I feel like I don't know why you don't like it. I don't know whether you don't.
Yeah.
That's the one thing. I feel like you need to put your money where your mouth is.
No, I've never said I don't like it. I said I don't love it.
Okay. Well, why not love it?
And I think for me... Go on.
Sorry to cop out, but yeah. Well.
Cop out. I think for me, it's the hype that spoilt it. And perhaps what I should do is come back to it again at another time, after a break, and see if I enjoy it more in a second read. I mean, Charlie, you've read it twice now, and I think you liked it the first time anyway, didn't you? But having reread it, you obviously still really love it. So yeah, it was a very enjoyable read, but I don't think I would at the moment go around and say to people like, you must read this book. But I think I could think of several people straight off the top of my head who I know would love it and that I could recommend it to, but I don't think I could shout about it in the same way as maybe others Donatar are.
I kind of wanted to have a more aggressively hateful opinion than that, to be honest. I'm not holding out. You sort of said you don't love it, but it's fine. I kind of want you to absolutely yeah.
It's real.
Yeah.
You wanted me to rip it apart, didn't you? Yeah, sorry.
I was looking for a sort of juicy fight. You know, Charlie, what were you going to say? I talked across you, sorry.
I was just going to say that I feel like it's one of those sorts of, on the subject of like, or the idea of recommending it and going like, you must read this or something like that. I feel like this is the sort of book that I would use for someone who isn't into reading yet, to try and like convince them like, come with us, it's really good, there's loads of fun stuff. Like,
and actually that is a really fair point. So quite a few people, Sarah from Vienna, Siama from France, Jolie in England, Alessandra from Brazil, all asked kind of why this book was chosen. And Charlie, part of the reason, you know, I spoke to Charlie about really struggling with what book to choose, and the criteria were kind of, it has to be escapist, not too long or impenetrable, and you know, and have a kind of interesting angle. I think here it was the fact that the lead character is a 14-year-old girl in quite extraordinary circumstances in quite an extraordinary time. And I think, you know, for those reasons, I guess that's why it seemed like a good one. Like, you know, the fact that it is a kind of relatively easy read for people of all ages, and relatively short. I think it was kind of part of why it was picked. But that's not to say that it's an easy read or a light read at all. Anyway, thank you.
I thought it was brilliant. It was so brilliantly unexpected, and it was so much more than I hoped that it would be. So I'm delighted that you encouraged me to be here.
Glad you liked it, and I now need to go watch both films because I've not seen either.
Yeah, I've not seen either.
Yeah,
I haven't seen the first one, but the second one is excellent.
I've basically resisted watching the Coen Brothers one the whole time because I wanted to have an untainted view of the book. But it looks so good. It looks brilliant.
It is, and the casting is phenomenal. You got a treat in store. As far as I can remember, it might have been distracted by crying.
I love the sound of that cinema experience as well. Yeah, I can't thank you all enough. It was really, really fun.
Thanks for having us.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been great.
So
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah,
nice to see you, Dan.
2020's version of getting to actually meet someone.
I genuinely, just before this, I'd like just finished my dinner when like we were texting just beforehand, and I thought like, all right, I've just had my dinner and I'm going to meet people, so I better go and brush my teeth.
I know.
And I so nearly brushed my teeth.
I did brush my teeth. It's like a mental thing.
Oh, that's amazing.
I had exactly the same thought process I was doing. I was like, this is insane. I made my it's disgusting. But I didn't.
But so many people have said oh, I've got a Zoom. There's an excuse to like not wear my pajamas or like if you wear makeup to put makeup on or whatever, yeah. It's been fun. But thank you guys.
I've got slippers on, but there you
go. Yeah, everyone stands up and they have nothing on them.
I've got Spurs on.
Oh, we should have all worn Spurs.
next time.
Yeah, next time. Guys, thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too. Cheers, guys.
Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Distraction tactics. Distraction tactics. Distraction tactics.
Hi, Allie. Thanks for joining Distraction Tactics today. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Excited to chat about True Grit as a film. So, Charlotte, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well, thank you. Really well. And it's been a joy to watch these two films, one of which I saw many, many years ago, and one of which I saw even a few years ago. And then I did it all backwards because I saw the Coen Brothers film first, then the John Wayne version, and then read the book novel. So I've done it all backwards, but now I'm going to try and get it all to go forwards again.
It's like some sort of weird Memento experience.
And Memento, yes, absolutely. That's something we can talk about because these films are both Westerns, but also revenge genre. So they kind of mix two genres, which is really interesting because I love both of them.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking is, why does this novel make such a great movie that people want to make it and then remake it? And those are really interesting questions to ask. And I don't know whether you want to respond.
It's a quest. There's something happens. The lead character wants to set it right in her own way, and she goes on a mission from start to finish and essentially gets there. And I guess I'm probably being really basic about it, but there's something about that, the simplicity of that sort of journey, and the sort of seeking to achieve something that is then achieved, that kind of lends itself quite well to the plot of a film. And
especially if you think of the times that we live in, this sense of fighting injustice and putting right wrongs, and that there is a good guy and a bad guy, and that if something isn't right, you set out to put it right, is very alluring, I think. But what I love about this film, and what I think makes so great a story, is that traditionally the Western is a really male world. It's cowboys and Stetsons and spurs and horses and frontiers and empty plains. And into this comes this incredible character, Matthew Ross, who's only 14, but she's just stronger and better and more intelligent and more feisty and more strong than any other man. And she literally earns her spurs. So it's just such a kind of empowering story. I think it should be shown in every school across the land.
Yeah, and not just because, I guess, her being a girl or a woman in that genre plays against time, but also her age as well. Like, it's just really cool to have someone, to show the potential sort of wit and intelligence of someone who's 14. There's a real culture of maybe like under appreciating and having lower expectations on people in their teens, but like that for me was really cool.
Yeah, I actually work at an all-girls school, and we teach grades 6 through 12. It's the same high school I attended. And I see girls showing examples of true grit every single day, whether it's taking a bad fall off their horse, or just recently we had to send our international students home because we could no longer offer classes on campus. And we had girls return to China, and instead of going home, they ended up being isolated in a hotel off the coast for 14 days while also navigating their schoolwork and what their home life is going to be. So I'm just, in reading this in conjunction with everything that's going on in the world, I'm so in awe of the girls that I get to work with. And I think, as you said, Dan, sometimes it's overlooked.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can't imagine what that must have been like for them. Part of the idea of distraction tactics was using film, and now obviously this book, to transport us somewhere that's so different. For us over here in the UK, like, the world that the book exists in is obviously a different time, but very much a different place. And to use these stories to sort of inspire and be transportative as well. So it's really cool. I mean, I guess you're slightly closer to the settings of this than we are, and obviously the equestrian world is one of yours. Charlie, you had some
So I've got a very short and probably incredibly easy quiz for you. I've got a small list of things that I didn't know, that if you could explain them for me, that would be much appreciated. So the first one is, what's a gelding?
Gelding is what a stallion was. So it's a male horse that cannot reproduce.
Oh, that's sad.
all girls.
What does crawfish mean? That might not be an equestrian thing.
Not a horse term.
Sorry. I now realise I might have just written down a whole bunch of words that I don't understand because
I think it's like a shrimp.
Okay. I don't understand why that would have come up in the book. Maybe I'm just a bit thicker than I thought I was.
Maybe you were quite confused with writing on the menu or something.
What's a corral or a corral, or a CORRAL?
It's a paddock, so someplace where a horse would go outside. You can, I guess, ride in one.
Just call it a paddock, guys. Come on. I clearly didn't get the translated version. What is a scrub?
A scrub?
Yeah, I think it comes from like she's describing the ponies that her dad had bought, that she wanted to sell back, and I think this is the context. She said they were all scrubs, or
TLC,
something like that.
TLC song.
Yeah, okay.
I can think of it. I mean, I know they're cow ponies, so I'm not sure if that relates at all.
But I mean, like I said, I'm slightly proving my point in that none of us know, but we still all like kind of got what happened in the story, right? So it's okay. Burrs? What's a burr? I think of a burr as something to do with a coffee grinder.
Like a burr or a spur?
A burr? I mean, I know what a spur is. Come on. Give me something.
You asked me what a crawfish is.
You are
double up.
You're making it sound like your first rodeo, so don't be insulted.
First rodeo,
it's
great.
like a thing that can get caught, it's like a plant, and it can get caught in like a horse's tail or their hair, even dogs. Just
Allie, I think we need to emphasize to you like quite how little we know, not just about sort of equestrian life, but probably just outdoorsy life. Full stop.
don't worry, I can't keep my plants alive, so I'm right there.
Okay, good.
Okay, one more, and I think this one might be quite easy. What does shod mean?
A horse having shoes.
And we're done. Well done. You got lots out of some. So
I can't believe you didn't
congratulations.
ask me. I had a whole list of words. Not one of those words is on my list.
Shod. I'm going to start using that just when I'm wearing shoes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you ready to leave the house? Yes, I'm shod.
And if they're hurt in one of their legs, you call them lame. So you can use that too, just in regular life.
I'm often hurt in one of my legs.
You're lame.
And I'm always lame, so Ali, thanks so much. Were there any words that you spotted in the book that you assumed we'd be completely perplexed by?
Stockings. Maddie says little Blackie has stockings, and if you watch the movie, he doesn't.
I did pick up on that. I was expecting some. I mean, I didn't know specifically what stockings meant in terms of the leg of the horse, but I guessed that somewhere on a leg there might be some white.
So it's white that goes above the horse's knee, and a sock goes below their knee.
That's great.
Charlotte? Do you want to talk a bit about? Do you want to sort of divide the two up and talk about them and like just the idea of adaptation and what it is to adapt a book? I think, like you were saying, this really lends itself to being adapted. But yeah, who do you think does it better? It's interesting that the first adaptation came like a year after the serialization and the book came out,
and that Portis was involved with it.
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting. So the first version that stars famously John Wayne with his eye patch, and he actually won an Oscar for the role, is all shot in Technicolor. Whereas the second version, the Coen brothers, is much more austere and much more snow-filled, which is much closer to the original book, and is shot beautifully by Roger Deakins. And interestingly, they're both close to the book, but the first adaptation, if we call it number one, they felt a need to show family life that Mattie was trying to keep together. So we actually meet her father, whereas we don't in the book. He's already dead. And we don't in the Coen brothers version. He's already dead. And so there's this sense of needing to set it up.
I thought that was really interesting in the Coen brothers adaptation. They're really clever that prolonged shot of the dad's corpse on the ground, having just been killed. I thought it felt really respectful of the novel, that it allowed the sort of opening pages of the novel to be basically read verbatim and allowed to breathe with a single image. That for me, in terms of like setting a tone, they, like you said, they could have done so much more with that. We could have seen it happen, and we could have seen the dad and introduce his character, and it's kind of all the more interesting for his absence. I just thought, that was.
I saw this very interesting talk with Jeff Bridges where he says, why did the Coen brothers feel the need to do a new version when there was this already kind of iconic version with a Oscar-winning performance? And they said they weren't thinking about that film at all. They were just thinking about the novel.
Yeah.
It was an incredible novel, and they felt compelled to tell that story. And there are several differences in the first version, and the Coen brothers one is almost, I mean, it literally is script to screen. The language is really similar. The voiceover, every event is there, and it's just much more true to the book.
Which I think that really took away from my enjoyment of the film, having just read the book and then watching the film. Because it's so close, which is great, and I think it really works as an adaptation. I found myself just thinking about the things that felt different from what I just read, and maybe that's just something about watching the film or something you literally just read, maybe it needs a bit more breathing space. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely breathed an enormous sigh of relief in the opening shot when then a voiceover came in. I was like, okay, then like, but like, I mean, like we said when we discussed the book, like that opening, and so many people who've talked about the book have said that opening is so good that it would have been a shame to waste it. And yeah, it's difficult. Anytime to watch an adaptation of something that you like, and B, particularly if you read it really recently, a lot of what you're going to be doing is just picking up on the things that they got wrong. You're going to be going in kind of looking for what they've screwed up, essentially.
Yeah.
Which is and like, I hate it when people do that, but I was definitely doing that when I was watching it. But like, I would say mostly I was really happy with it. And I think like part of why you would want to make a film of True Grit is that like half the work is done for you because the script is there. There's so much like there's so much of Matty's like recollection is conversations, and also at the point where Rooster's introduced to us in the courtroom, we just have the courtroom transcript, which is just a script. So like that kind of makes it a pretty easy job, and all of that southern, like beautiful southern language that we were talking about beforehand, it's just there, and it's quite easy to just pick up and run with it.
I think the film felt like quite cinematic, and I think the sets and the costumes may be more impressive, and like I texted you this, Charlie, but everything felt a little bit more beautiful and idyllic and clean.
Even like Rooster's digs behind the Chinese guy's store felt like too clean,
a bit too polished. I think that the book really gave this gritty sense of kind of dirty, unkempt. So that for me, I found off-putting. I also think that because maybe the dialogue was Jeff Bridges really mumbles so much of that dialogue. I felt like that for me was a real barrier. Like lots of the set pieces were beautiful. The explosions of violence were done, in a way that was as shocking as in the novel. I thought loads of it felt great to me, but I thought like so much of it's about the dialogue, and actually I wanted to hear it a bit more and almost have it delivered more. And
interesting about the different versions between the Jeff Bridges versus the John Wayne. Yeah. And what was really interesting about the earlier version was it was different from the novel, and it was written by this amazing female screenwriter called Margaret Roberts, and she had been blacklisted because her husband, who were one of the highest paid screenwriters at the time, refused to put their friends in. They were one of the blacklisted.
The McCarthy thing.
Yeah.
Oh wow!
And so she was one of the highest paid. She'd started as just a secretary, worked her way up to being one of the highest paid screenwriters, and she couldn't write for ages. When she was finally allowed to write, she wrote True Grit, and John Wayne said it was one of the best screenplays he'd ever read, and it's very easy. It's great. So I do recommend watching it, and it's interesting to compare the two.
Yeah, there's some homework for us.
Just on the kind of idea of kind of changes to the book and how faithful things are, and when you go in to something that you've just read looking for the changes. I thought it was quite interesting, Charlotte, that one of the things that you talked about at the start to do with kind of the ideas bit and kind of Matty's character is the idea of earning her spurs and stuff like that. One of the things that like got to me a little bit with the Coen Brothers adaptation is that the conversation about earning your spurs between LaBeef and Matty happens with just LaBeef and Matty, and Rooster doesn't cut across it like he does in the book, saying, no, we're not having any of that sentimental stuff, because it was just like just being a bit of a miserable sod. Rooster cutting across that and being like, I don't want any sentimental stuff. I really enjoyed that and thought that kind of just little moments like that for me, they tell me a lot about a character. And I think cutting that bit specifically out, that's such a tiny detail, just serves to kind of give it a little bit of that kind of Hollywood schmaltz edge, to kind of give it, oh, isn't that nice that he said she earned her spurs? Oh, anyway, just that's me being a cynic anyway.
No. But those are the things that make the book work. That kind of constant undercutting of any over saccharine sort of.
Yeah, it's like atypical in that way, which is why the book is so interesting and
but
strong.
The ending, we haven't really talked about the ending, which, you know, most Hollywood movies, they'd get together in the end, or they'd ride off to the sunset together, or there was this possibility, but none of that. She went, you know, she lost her arm. Rooster died before she got to see him again, and she was still in love with LeBeef, but he hadn't contacted her. And it was like, oh, I really like that. It was great.
No, it's such a good ending. It's so, and the way that it sort of just twists that, they achieved their mission, and that's great. And then it's like, oh, but life's really complicated and a bit shit. So here you go.
And interestingly, although John Wayne won an Oscar for his performance as Best Actor, because Hayley was only, I think, 13 when she did the role, she wasn't put forward as Best Actress. She was put forward as Best Supporting Actress and nominated as Best Supporting Actress. But I remember at the time there was a big furore because it's her movie, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And she was put forward as Best Supporting Actress, and I think the actress from 21 Grams, right? But
so in Distraction Tactics Film Club, every week we've been checking whether or not the film or the story passes the Bechdel test. Like, Charlotte, do you want to just introduce what that is and what that means?
Yeah, it's a scale really to say, is there in the movie a character with a name and some sort of job? Does she talk to another woman who's got a name and some sort of job? And do they weirdly, which, I mean, honestly, who came up with these? Could they talk about anything other than a man? I mean, extraordinary, but so many films do not pass that test, believe it or not. So this one absolutely does, because Mattie Ross is our lead character. Fantastic. Although she doesn't have a job, she has a mission, which is to find her father's killer.
And she's also like, she just shows herself to be like an accountant, a businesswoman, a negotiator, not to mention a cowgirl.
A lawyer.
Yeah,
She's smarter, she rides faster. She's fantastic on every level. So we love her. And there's the lady in the boarding house who's got a job, who runs the boarding house. There's the grandma in the bed. There's her mother at home. So there are a number of women, which is, if you think of the film that was made at the same time, which was which I love, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, was made the same time as the original True Grit. You couldn't get two more different movies. Butch Cassidy is much more kind of its time and kind of groovy, but even then, Catherine Ross has got a tiny, tiny part. So how empowering this movie is to have all of those things. And yeah.
Guys, thank you all so much. Allie, was there anything that you wanted to add? I love what you said earlier. It was really brilliant. Thank you.
Just one thing. I don't know about anybody else, but when I was reading this, I was kind of taken aback by the way Mattie speaks, because she's very blunt and bold and honest.
Yeah.
And in reading this and thinking about everything that's going on, it made me realize that the way she speaks is so liberating, because as evidence in this novel, if you use your voice in a powerful way, as small as you might think it is, you can make a big impact and get the job done if you combine that with tenacity and determination. So that's something that really impressed me about her in this novel. And I really loved it.
Yeah, no, it really is. She's really amazing, isn't she? She's like such an impressive character. And thank you. That, I think you just put it perfectly.
Yeah.
really. But yeah, just the idea that someone can, no matter who they are, can make a difference and you know, put their intelligence to achieving what they want to achieve and you know, doing what's right. so speaks to everything that's happening now. I'm slightly worried that we're going to get cut off any second. So if that happens, thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, it's been great.
It's been
Nice meeting the two of you properly.
Charlotte,
Nice seeing you, Dan.
Charlotte, thanks so much. Charlotte and Ali, you just thank you so much. Thank you for all the thought and effort you put into this. Really appreciate it.